What's going on, folks? Welcome to another episode of Hardware Pushers, the series I thought was dead, but hey, it's back from the grave. Today's episode, we're going to talk about the Sega Saturn. Now, the Sega Saturn is one of my favorite systems of all time, and it's a very unique system. It was originally designed with just 2D graphics in mind, and when the PlayStation was unveiled, Sega realized they needed some 3D graphics, so it was added at the last bit. That made the architecture of the system very difficult for programmers to program for, and it was a very interesting system. Although it wasn't a commercial success in North America, it did very well in Japan. Now, I want to preface this video by saying two things. The first thing, I'm focusing on only North American titles only for the Sega Saturn. Now, that does mean I do limit myself a bit, but I thought it was better to do it that way. I want to do a Japan-only video one day of all systems, so I focused only on North American. And the second thing is, I did leave some games off this list. Some were done purposefully, because I like to be able to, possibly do a future episode on the Saturn in the future. Much like with the NES, I left a couple games off, did the same thing with the Saturn. So this is just my list. Let me know what games you would have included in the comments section down below. Now sit back, relax, and let's talk about some Sega Saturn hardware pushers.
Who gives you raging arcade gameplay? Who gives you the most authentic sports games? Who gives you a game that lets you fly? And who gives you access to the internet on your TV? Play games, surf the net, only on Sega Saturn.
The Sega Saturn was an interesting system because it wasn't designed with 3D graphics in mind. Because of that, many third-party developers shied away from the system in comparison to the PlayStation, which was a much friendlier system to develop for when compared to the Saturn, and 3D gaming had just started to take off. Resident Evil for the Saturn, however, is proof that 3D games could run just as well as on the PlayStation, when the development team could access the tricky architecture properly. Resident Evil is a third-person survival horror game that got a late port to the Sega Saturn. The Saturn port of Resident Evil was pretty impressive considering the technical hurdles, and included new costumes, a slightly revised control scheme, a new enemy type, and an exclusive battle mode. The graphics were some of the best 3D character models on the Sega Saturn, with some preferring the Saturn models over the PlayStations. Resident Evil is easily one of the best looking 3D games on the Saturn. Considered by many to be the impossible port, the Saturn version of Quake is a technical marvel on every level. Developed by Lobotomy Software, Quake is a first-person shooter originally released to huge critical affair on the PC as being the first true 3D shooter, with its own engine dubbed the Quake engine. The Saturn version actually doesn't use the Quake engine, but uses a previous engine designed by Lobotomy called Slave Driver, which was used in Power Slave, another first-person shooter game on the Saturn. The main difference was that Power Slave used 2D sprites for the enemies, whereas Quake uses 3D character models for the enemies. This version of Quake also features some advanced lighting techniques that weren't even in the PC version of the game. While the frame rate does suffer and dips below 20 frames per second numerous times in the game, Quake has no business being on the Saturn in the first place, but it's on there, and it's definitely a Sega Saturn hardware pusher. With Super Mario 64 and Crash Bandicoot leading the 3D mascot charge of 1996, Sonic was nowhere to be found. Instead, Sega came out with Knights, which ended up becoming a cult classic. Knights was an action game featuring a purple jester named Knights, and featured flight-based gameplay. The main draw to Knights was the introduction of a new 3D controller that featured an analog stick, which was introduced to combat the recently released N64, which also featured an analog stick. Knights makes excellent use of the Saturn's hardware, which was created with 2D graphics in mind, by creating a 2.5D game that plays on a 2D plane but features 3D environments. Knights has some of the most advanced use of colors seen on the Sega Saturn, and features a lot of eye-popping visuals and huge, crisp textures. The combination of rich graphical output and introducing a new controller gives Knights a spot on this list. A stall could be on a number of lists for the Sega Saturn, including a Hidden Gems ones, but it is also deserving of a spot on hardware pushers. A stall is a platform game released early in the Saturn's life cycle that capitalizes on the Sega Saturn's strengths, 2D graphics. Featuring completely hand-drawn graphics, a stall looks and flows like a cartoon, with rich and detailed characters, fluid animation, and some interesting backgrounds. The color palette in a stall is arguably one of the best on the Sega Saturn, with colors popping off of your TV screen. Character sprites are massive, and the game even incorporates some pseudo 3D moments that makes this one of the most graphically pleasing Saturn releases. Sega was known as an arcade powerhouse, and the Sega Model 2 board produced some of the highest grossing arcade games of all time. Two of those games made this list, and the first one is Sega Rally. A racing game that incorporates racing on a variety of terrains, Sega Rally manages to be an excellent arcade port. While the graphics did take a bump down from the arcade version, Sega Rally has a silky smooth and consistent frame rate that keeps the racing action at a brisk pace. Arguably the best racing game and arcade racing port on the Sega Saturn, Sega Rally's impressive frame rate and graphics make it a no-brainer as a hardware pusher. The second Sega Model 2 game on the list has to be Virtua Fighter 2. Virtua Fighter 2 is a 3D fighting game that features some of the best visuals on the Sega Saturn. While there were some cuts made from the arcade version like in Sega Rally, they are much less noticeable this time around. Backgrounds use parallax scrolling instead of polygon objects, but this sacrifice was made in order to ensure the one thing that makes Virtua Fighter 2 a true hardware pusher: 60 frames per second gameplay. The game never dips below 60 frames, making it arguably the best 32-bit fighter in terms of graphics on any 32-bit system. To go along with that 60 frames per second was another technical feat. The game ran natively at 704 by 480 out on the Sega Saturn, which was even higher than the arcade version. Capcom started to hit its stride in the mid-90s with tons of iconic arcade fighters, and one of the best that made its way onto the Saturn was XMen: Children of the Atom. A 2D fighter featuring X-Men characters, X-Men Children of the Atom was arguably the most impressive 2D fighter released in North America for the Sega Saturn. Retaining nearly all of the graphics from the arcade version, Children of the Atom has fast, blistering gameplay, a massive color palette, huge character sprites, flashy special moves, and a rock-solid frame rate. The PS1 version of this game was a complete mess compared to the Saturn version, which managed to showcase the Saturn's dominance when it came to the 2D genre. The Saturn was home to many excellent shoot-'em-up or shmup games, but sadly only a small fraction of them were released outside of Japan. One of them that made it out was Galactic Attack, developed by Taito, and it is definitely the most impressive North American Saturn shoot-'em-up. A top-down vertical shooter, Galactic Attack features a fantastic frame rate that remains rock solid amid all of the chaos in the game. Backgrounds are multi-layered and feature some really good depth, with objects in the foreground textured as well. Explosions are huge, your ship shoots off lasers at a blistering pace, and boss battles are absolutely massive, and many of them feature some interesting graphical techniques such as pseudo 3D animations. One of the last games released for the Sega Saturn, Burning Rangers, was a 3D action-adventure game which had you saving people as a futuristic firefighter. Depending on who you ask, Burning Rangers either has some of the best graphics on the Saturn or some of the worst. While the game did feature some graphical glitches, as a free-roam 3D game on a system not designed with that in mind, Burning Rangers is impressive for the console it was released on. Using a modified Knights engine, Burning Rangers features large and colorful polygons, and also uses the Saturn's 3D controller that came with Knights. And honestly, if you disagree with this pick being on the list, enjoy this quote from the main programmer, Takuya Matsumoto. "The fact that we have been able to push the Saturn hardware this far is enough for me to die happy. If that ain't a hardware pusher, I don't know what is." This is a bit of a late inclusion on the list, but a worthy one, I feel. Yes, Sonic Jam is a port of Genesis Sonic games, but that's not why it's on the list. Saturn owners never got a 3D Sonic game, but they did get a small taste of one with Sonic Jam Sonic World, in which you could traverse a museum-like area as Sonic in 3D. This small gesture proved that the Sonic could have been, and should have been, a 3D entry on the Sega Saturn, as it looks and flows beautifully. Come on, Sega, you really couldn't release a 3D Sonic on the Saturn? I think this proves that you could.
And that's my list for North American Sega Saturn hardware pushers. These games, I feel, really push the Sega Saturn to its limits, and there's a good variety of games on here, so I would definitely recommend checking out some of these games. Games like Burning Rangers are very expensive, but there are some cheaper ones on this list. Let me know what you think about these games, what your experiences with these games were, and thank you for checking out this video. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe to the channel, leave me a like, and I will catch you guys next time on the next Hardware Pushers. Later.
RGT 85, RGT 85. RGT 85.